Podcast, a show where we examine the latest trends affecting radiology. I'm your host, Chris Hobson, and today we'll be talking with Richard E. Heller III, MD, MBA. Dr. Heller serves as Associate Chief Medical Officer for Communications and Health Policy, as well as National Director of Pediatric Radiology at Radiology Partners. Dr. Heller, we really appreciate you being here today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
Well, thank you for giving your time to us today. Today we are going to try to tackle a somewhat complicated subject, which is the No Surprises Act, which is a reaction to something called surprise insurance gaps, or as it's more commonly known, surprise billing. So late last year, Congress did pass something called the No Surprises Act to counteract this concerning problem. But for those viewers who may be uninitiated in the subject matter, on surprise billing. Can you please start by giving us a basic idea of what the practice actually is?
Sure. So first of all, let me again say thank you very much for having me here. And I do agree, it is a confusing subject.
It is.
So before we get into like surprise medical billing or surprise insurance gap, just like something that many people might not know, and I didn't know initially, is that when medical groups, radiology practices, they contract with insurance companies. And the hospitals do too. So, you're a radiology practice working at, St. Elsewhere Hospital. So you're going to contract with, the insurance companies and their various health plans. And the hospital is going to separately contract with the insurance companies and their various health plans. And sometimes those plans don't perfectly align. And insurance companies may want to have narrower networks and they might not include everybody. But for whatever reason, sometimes there's not perfect alignment. And what happens, unfortunately, is that patients can fall into that gap. So, the prototypical example of surprise medical billing is that somebody who has, private health insurance and they get unexpected, unanticipated care from an out-of-network provider. And here's the example that gets given a lot. You get hurt at home. You Google where the nearest in-network hospital is. You go to the in-network hospital. You do everything right. And then unbeknownst to you, at that in-network hospital, one of the providers, one of the physicians who was there, who took care of you, wasn't in that particular health plan's network. And because they were not in that health plan network, the amount of money that you owe out of pocket can be far more. And I think everybody agrees that's a significant problem. It's a flaw in our system and that it needed to be addressed.
Absolutely. And I know, like you said, this is not a new problem. It's been around for quite a while now. So how does this new law that we've been alluding to, and I think we should say up front, the law does go into effect in 2022. So we're still in the lead up to it. But how does this new law actually protect patients?
So the first thing it does is it holds patients harmless. So that's the expression, hold patients harmless. And by the way, there were lots of bills passed out of committee in Congress. They all did that. They all said, look, we need to start with this. We need to stop putting patients in the middle of payment disputes between insurance companies and providers. So if you're a patient and you have private health insurance, you've done everything right, and you get unexpected, unanticipated care from an out-of-network provider, you just owe your normal in-network cost sharing amount. And so that was one way they just took them out of the middle, right? Take patients out of the middle of those payment disputes between insurance companies and physicians and hold patients harmless. Just, you don't get to dodge your in-network cost sharing. You still got to pay your in-network cost sharing. Absolutely. You don't get out of that, but you don't have to pay the other stuff. So that was the first part. The second part that the NSA did, the No Surprises Act did, was that it really made an effort to protect access to care. And it did that by incentivizing network contracting and good faith negotiations between insurance companies and providers. And the NSA really went out of its way to say, look, we do not want to give one side leverage more than the other. We want to promote network contracting. We want to promote good faith negotiations, because when you do that, then you incentivize practices to make investments in things like quality improvement, to have more services, to make things more available, to make them more attractive to insurers. We want to incentivize that behavior. And so that behavior then increases access to care for patients. So those were two different ways that the NSA was really useful in terms of protecting patients, because it holds them harmless and it protects their access to care.
Absolutely. And we should also note that when you say NSA, you mean No Surprises Act.
No Surprises Act, not
there's
the
a more
national
famous
security.
NSA.
Yeah.
We don't want to freak anyone out. Right.
Yeah,
no one's
right.
under surveillance. Right. Okay.
That's the problem. We've got too many acronyms in healthcare.
That's right. Well, that's a holdover from government. That's not your fault. So you touched on it just now, and I guess for context, we should say that states have tried over the span of time this has been an issue to pass their own kind of legislation, and we'll get to that a little bit later in our discussion. So, but why do you believe a federal bill was needed, and at this point?
So that's an important question because like 30 something states have passed laws on surprise medical billing, on the surprise insurance gap. Some of them are comprehensive, some of them are not comprehensive, but many states have no law. So we had some states that have no law, some states that have partial laws, some states that have comprehensive laws. And by the way, they all use different approaches and none of them were exactly the same, right? So you've got an incredible patchwork. So that was one issue, was one, we just didn't have a federal standard. There was no national standard. And so we said, look, some states don't even have anything. We need to have a federal standard. We think this is a real problem, and we do. So that was one issue. The other issue has to do with something called Erisa, which rhymes with Melissa because I kept mispronouncing it. And that's how I remembered how to pronounce it, Erisa Plans. So Erisa Plans are these private health insurance plans that are self-funded. So typically it's like, some big company that has employer-sponsored insurance, and they're self-funded. These are the Erisa plans. And Erisa plans are not under state jurisdiction, they're under federal jurisdiction. And they have, 130, 140 something million people in this country that have private health insurance are on Erisa plans. And the Erisa plans have their jurisdiction at the federal level. So if you want to actually deal with surprise medical billing, this surprise insurance gap, you've got to deal with the Erisa plans, which means we needed a federal law to deal with it.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense because you're educating me, because when I'm reading this, I'm like, well, I thought it seems like the states, there's a lot of people have that impulse, just let the states deal with it. So I think that's important that you cleared that up. Thank you.
No, I found that confusing too. And that's why I had to, and I kept mispronouncing Erisa until finally was like, it rhymes with Melissa. Just say
that's what
Erisa
they need to
rhymes
do.
with Melissa.
We need to have federal legislation where all acronyms are just people's names or something. Because
or it rhymes with something so I can remember how to
rhymes with
it.
a name. Exactly.
Right.
So we all can be on the same page. Yeah.
Right.
Well, since surprise billing is so unfair, and I think I don't think that's I don't think that's a subjective statement. I think there's pretty much a consensus at this point that is fairly unfair. It depends who you ask, probably, but and so many people from so many different sides agree that it's kind of unfair. Why is it so hard? Why was it so hard up to this point to pass national law against it?
So you ask a really great question, and I found it frustrating that some people felt that if you were against a certain bill on surprise medical billing, well, that meant that you were for surprise medical billing. Well, wait a minute. There's this bill out there against surprise medical billing. If you don't support it, you support surprise medical billing. And then you had to explain to people, no, that's not the case. That laws on surprise medical billing actually do two things. And the first one's obvious. The first one is they end surprise medical billing, right? And that part was non-controversial. It's patient protective, it's patient centric, and there was broad support. Every bill that passed out of Congress on surprise medical billing on this issue took patients out of the middle, held them harmless, and would end the issue of surprise medical billing. So that part was easy. It was the second part that people didn't necessarily understand immediately. And that is that laws on surprise medical billing, because they have the ability to manipulate in-network rates, are actually sort of controversial because they can disrupt good faith negotiations. Do not take my word for this, by the way. The Congressional Budget Office, in their analysis, a couple of the bills specified this, and they were very clear. They said that laws on surprise medical billing have the ability to disrupt, or whatever the language they used was, negotiations between providers and insurance companies, and can change in-network rates. And they actually were pretty clear that the majority, I think they said 80%, of the budgetary effects of the surprise medical billing laws that they looked at, one from the House Energy and Commerce and one from the Senate Help Committee, the vast majority, 80% of the budgetary effects of those laws would come from changes in the in-network rates. So it wasn't talking about the out-of-network rates. It was saying it was going to reduce in-network rates. And the numbers they quoted was that while there'd be regional variability, on average, rates would go down 15 to 20% nationally as a result of the surprise medical billing law. Now, again, these are the in-network rates. Right. And I think that's what people didn't understand, is that we all agree we wanted to end surprise medical billing, but we wanted to do so in a way that protects good faith negotiations, that protects our practices, and that protects our patients. And that's what the debate was actually about.
Right. And I wonder if I could surprise you with a question we didn't think about beforehand, okay. But I was wondering if you might talk about, just real briefly, I think it's always good to contextualize it within radiology, because we're talking about these fairly big abstract ideas, but they have real world consequences on real doctors and real patients. So, I mean, maybe even anecdotally, is this something you've dealt with, or that you know colleagues have dealt with, and why? I guess specifically, is it bad for radiology that this has been allowed to go on?
Sure. So let's give an example. So, I would give talks on surprise billing around the country. This is, predating the No Surprises Act. And I had people come to me and say, Rich, I got to tell you, I appreciate you coming here to give this talk, but, our practice is we're almost exclusively in network. We don't surprise bill, and we have really good contracts. So I don't really care about this. And you know what, Rich, if let's say we're 2% out of network, and all I'm going to get is the median in-network rate for those 2%, which I don't really care. That's fine. And what I had to explain to them was, you're the one who's on the menu. That if you go look at the CBO score, you are the practice that's on the menu. That if a bill were to pass that uses the median in-network rate as a benchmark payment system, then that is going to dramatically affect the specialty and many of the practices around it, because it will give insurance companies unbalanced leverage to then call up practices that have rates that are above that and then simply cancel them. And in fact, we've seen some evidence around the country anecdotally about that. The Anesthesia Society, ASA, did an informal survey in 2020, and they looked at how many of their practices had been receiving mid-contract notices of termination, non-renewal, asking for significant reductions in reimbursement. And there's a hypothesis that many people believe that this was being incentivized by a belief that a surprise medical billing law was going to pass using the median in-network rate as a benchmark.
Okay, that makes sense. Well, thank you for contextualizing that. And indulging me, it wasn't something we talked about before, but it just occurred to me that it might be nice to bring it down to earth for just 1 minute. Well, and you mentioned benchmarking just there. And my next question has to do with that. I was wondering if you could explain, a little bit more of the nuts and bolts of how the new law works and how it's different from past efforts, and maybe even how it's different than some like the patchwork you talked about before, state efforts. I mean, I hear terms like you just mentioned, benchmarking, arbitration. Can you explain what all this is about?
Sure. So the patient's going to have to pay the normal in-network cost sharing, but then the remainder, the balance, would then get paid by the insurance company. And a question was, well, how much does the insurance company pay? How do we figure out that number? And there were two big approaches. One approach was to value the service using an established benchmark, for example, Medicare. So we're going to use 85% of Medicare, 100% of Medicare, 110% of Medicare. We're going to use Medicare as a benchmark. Another way to benchmark would be to use the median in-network rate that plan uses. And this is the one that got a lot of traction. They said, fine, we won't use Medicare because Medicare has its own issues, but we'll use the median rate, the 50th percentile that plan pays. And that seemed very attractive to people because they're like, look, you're not going to get the best rate, but you're also not going to get the worst rate. You're going to get the 50th percentile. And so that seemed very attractive initially. However, it disregards the analogy of what will happen if you use that as a standard. If you use it as a standard, then that then becomes the new ceiling. So to use the example I gave before, if you were to pass a law that uses the median in-network rate, and this was proposed by Congress, to use the median in-network rate as the payment standard, and we can put some numbers on it to make it maybe a little easier to understand. So let's say the 50th percentile rate is $50 for a service. The 100th percentile is $100. But let's say your practice, your rate is $60. So you're getting $60 for a service, $10 above the median. So if a law were to pass using that $50 as the median rate, well, the insurance company would simply call you up and say, hi, you have two choices. We're okay with either one. One, you can go out of network. And if you go out of network with us, you're not going to get $60. You're going to get $50. You're also not going to get paid as quickly because you're going to have to go out of network and fight us for the money. You'll get it eventually, but it's certainly going to delay your revenue cycle process. Or you can stay in network, but you're not going to get $60. In fact, you're not going to get $50 because it's very beneficial for you to be in network. You're going to get paid faster. You know what you're going to get paid. You'll have less cost. It will decrease your revenue cycle time. So instead of $50, $47 or some number like that. What you've done is you've taken everybody that's above the median and you've told the insurance companies that you can push them out of network or make them take a significantly lower rate.
Yeah.
And that's what happens with benchmarking, even benchmarking at the median in-network rate level. So it doesn't just affect those 2% of cases that you're out of network on, it would then push you out of network or force you to accept a below median rate.
Hmm.
The other approach is using arbitration. And the entire idea of arbitration is to protect good faith negotiations, not to favor the insurance companies or the medical practices, but rather incentivize both groups to be reasonable, incentivize network contracting. And in fact, that's what we've seen used in other places. And that was the approach that the No Surprises Act used, which is using an arbitration-based model to incentivize good faith negotiations and incentivize network contracting.
Yeah, and I can see somebody, and I myself am wondering that arbitration, if we could just zoom in on that for a second. Can you just give like a general explanation as to who is the arbiter and how that actually works?
Sure. So several states already have it. So New York actually was the first state to pass comprehensive surprise medical billing law legislation. And they use an arbitration-based model. And what it says is that, patients are held harmless. They're out of the way. They're held harmless. They're not in the middle. And if the insurance company and the physician practice can't come together and figure something out, then they have to go to a third-party, non-conflicted arbiter. And that arbiter then makes a decision about what it's going to be. They each have to give a best and final offer. And most of them use, including New York, something called baseball-style arbitration, which is used in baseball, where each side gives one offer, and then the arbiter selects one of the two. They can't, to use the expression, split the baby. So if one side says 50 and one side says 100, the arbiter can't choose 75. They have to choose either 50 or 100. And what using baseball style arbitration means is that both sides are incentivized to be reasonable. Because if you give some crazy number, you're going to lose because the other side has to simply give a less crazy number and you'll automatically lose. Right. So both sides are incentivized strongly to contract, to give reasonable numbers. And what we've seen in New York is it's in less than 4 years, their plan saved consumers over $400 million. It decreased out-of-network billing. And it is worth noting that I went through their report. Radiology was less than 1% of disputes. So even though radiology has not been a bad actor in this, and we were less than 1%, they didn't quantify how much lower. We were in the less than 1% category. We're still affected by this. So it still makes sense for us to be aware of what's going on.
Of course. And it's funny that New York is the baseball arbiter. It's just such a baseball oriented place. I think that's appropriate.
Well, Texas is the same, right? You've got Texas and New York.
Texas and New York. Wow.
Who's next? So Texas, we can all agree Texas and New York have very different, local culture, local color. But Texas also has an arbitration-based model. Big baseball. Yeah. And in Texas, they use an arbitration model. Most of them, interestingly, are settled by teleconference before it even goes to arbitration. And in Texas, their arbitration model has decreased consumer complaints more than, I think, 95% and decreased physician complaints like 70%.
Wow. So that's all the proof you need.
So now, we're seeing very strong evidence from arbitration.
Mm-hmm. And this, I'm so sorry to stick on this point. And if this is, I apologize if this is a really basic question, but who actually acts as the arbiter in a lot of these? I'm sure it's different.
It's not a stupid question. It's a great question. So you want to make sure that there has to be a list of arbiters, and both sides have to vet it, and they have to be non-conflicted.
Right.
And that's very important that it has to be non-conflicted, because there is a history of conflicted groups being used in surprise billing. In fact, in New York, what led to their law was the company called Ingenix that provided the data for what the reimbursement rate should be was actually owned by a very large insurance company. And the New York Attorney General got curious, like, it seems like they would have an incentive to manipulate the rates. And in fact, the New York Attorney General did an investigation, found out that was the case, and said, no, we can't have that. You can't be doing that. And so it's very important that you have non-conflicted data sources and non-conflicted arbiters.
Oh, I see. So it's like a data-oriented company who a lot of times access the arbiter.
Exactly. So they would give the data about what the usual and customary rate should be, which is what New York did prior to 2009.
I see.
They paid UCR, usual and customary rate. But the company that figured out what the usual and customary rate was actually owned by a big insurance company.
Well, you can't fault them for trying,
And the New York Attorney General's office found that company was actually skewing the rates.
I see.
And so there was a big lawsuit. This is all
So
public
it is a
information.
problem. Yeah.
Worth a Google. It's very interesting. And so,
Wow.
yes, you want to have non-conflicted arbiters and non-conflicted sources of information.
Well, and my next question was kind of about data and the experience with this approach. I mean, aside from like the New Yorks and the Texases of the world, do you foresee there being enough data and enough, for lack of a better word, arbiters to go around, locally to make this kind of a tenable situation? Or maybe I've painted it all wrong and they're going to centralize it somehow, or?
No, so you asked a good question, which is, and the No Surprises Act actually talks about this. It says that
Okay.
there's actually money to have states that don't have, excuse me, an all payer claims database, create one. And if you do have one, to improve it,
Gotcha.
to make sure that you have a robust source of information for where you should be getting your data about what the appropriate median and network rate is and what the appropriate claims are, and having some data about that. Again, it's important that it's actually comprehensive and non-conflicted.
Yeah, and I would assume there's some sort of built-in process for trying to avoid that kind of conflict, like you just mentioned in New York. But or maybe that's part of the rulemaking process going forward. I don't know, but
and that's part of the whole idea is you have to make sure, and that there has to be a list, and they have to be non-conflicted.
A recent article you authored found that and I'm quoting here, radiology practices, even those that are fully in network or that never practiced surprise billing, could nonetheless be affected by the NSA. You've already touched on this a little bit, but could you say a little bit more about how radiology groups might be affected, and if they should be concerned, what steps can they take going forward to ensure they don't, that that they're not somehow negatively, impacted by this, even though there are some unintended consequences there, maybe?
No, I'm glad you asked that, because I do want to reiterate, this is one of the main things that I wanted to make sure people understand is that, even if you're as a medical practice, you're doing everything right. You're in network, you're not surprise billing, you're not doing any of that. You're a good actor. You can still be impacted by this. There's that false narrative that only groups that were doing surprise medical billing or that was their financial strategy are going to be impacted by this. And that is absolutely not true. And that was, a main thing that I want people to understand, that you can be doing everything right and you can be negatively impacted by this. And I think that's caused a lot of confusion. I mean, certainly we saw that when people were lobbying against some of the bills in Congress that had to use a benchmark approach. And they thought that if you were against those bills, that meant that you supported surprise medical billing, which is not the case. So what I would encourage groups to do, now that the No Surprises Act is law, it's undergoing a rulemaking process. The first interim final rule has actually already come out, and the second one will be coming out sometime later this summer or early this fall. And these will detail how the law is actually operationalized. And the American College of Radiology has done a wonderful job monitoring this, will be commenting on these interim final rules, and has really been on top of the entire process. So my advice to people was simply to be engaged with the ACR and to keep an eye out using the Radiology Advocacy Network. Every week the ACR sends out a policy information email, giving you updates, showing you the letters, showing you the proposed rules. I would keep track of all that stuff, because the ACR has really been very, very helpful. It may very well be that there becomes a call to action where we ask people in the ACR to reach out to their Congress people, who will then reach out to the rulemaking bodies and specify, hey, we have concerns about this. We're concerned about how the No Surprises Act is being implemented. And if the college feels that it's important to do that, then they will have that call to action. So my suggestion to people was simply to stay engaged with the ACR and to read those bulletins.
Yeah, and that was actually part of my next question was, so much of this is on a national level at this point, and for the reasons you outlined earlier. And I was just kind of wondering, like, how can listeners, as this rulemaking is playing out and stuff like that, how can they kind of advocate for reasonable policy just in the meantime? But I think you've kind of laid it out right there. But is there anything beyond that anyone can do, or is this more of a just act when called upon and just kind of sit and wait and see how things play out? Or is there, because I know there's a lot of people listening who probably want to take some sort of action. So I guess if we could put a finer boundary around what they can actually do.
Sure. So that's an important question. So a lot of this, we're talking about the federal level, but there are still state laws and there's still action on state laws. So I would encourage people to be very engaged with their state radiological society, because that's where you're going to hear about what's going on in my state level. And there may very well be things you should be doing at the state level right now. Virginia they passed a law and they've just released their first bit of data on it. So we're still seeing states that are just passing laws, discussing them, and operationalizing them. And a huge question is going to be, how does the federal law interact with the state laws? In some cases, it's clear. In some cases, it's not clear. And so I think that's going to be an advocacy subject going forward is, hey, how should we be handling these states that have some law in the books, but there's also a federal law, to make sure that we have a process that isn't so confusing, where there's two-tier justice, where, these people go this way, these people go that way, and then everybody's getting confused.
Gotcha. And just as a last question, how do you see this playing out? Do you think that this is going to be a thing where, everything goes live 2022 and it's pretty much a smooth sailing from there? Or do you think this is going to be a constantly evolving thing over time where, one cohort pushes back against another and it's, you know what I mean? Like, is there going to be a point where everything is kind of settled, or is this just going to be a thing people are going to constantly have to be aware of?
So I was once told that if you're going to look into the crystal ball, be prepared to eat glass. So with the caveat that you're asking me to look into the crystal ball, then I might have to eat glass.
Yes.
My hypothesis is that it will go live in 2022, that the interim final rules are coming out. They're not doing proposed rules. They're doing interim final rules. So they're already putting out these final rules, that they plan to go live with it in 2022. Gotcha. However, I'll give two caveats. One, I think that the issues related to federalism, the interaction between the federal law and the state law, in my opinion, and I'm somebody who calls the lawyers who are really into this and asks them lots of questions, I find it to be incredibly confusing. And I think some of that may get actually settled in the court system, that there may be lawsuits about trying to figure out which one applies here and how that's going to be handled. I think that's going to be a big issue. And I also think that you make a good point that while the law itself in its statutory and there's, regulations, what's going to happen, that the actual rulemaking process will continue to evolve, and we will see, probably over the next several years, the system settle in. My hope is that the law through rulemaking will be implemented according to the way it was intended, according to what Congress has said, and that very quickly settles in, and that these issues go away, and that we now have a standard, and that patients are taken out of the middle. Both sides are encouraged to have good faith negotiations, and we end this issue of the surprise insurance gap.
Well, I hope that plays out the way that your crystal ball is showing you. So that's great. It's a great note to end on. It's been so nice talking to you. Where can people find you online if they'd like to continue this clearly important conversation?
Sure. So, I'm on Twitter at REH3MD, the number 3MD, at REH3MD. And honestly, if people have any questions, you can just email me directly at Richard.Heller, Heller, Richard.Heller at radpartners.com. Richard.Heller at radpartners.com. Just shoot me an email.
Well, thank you for making yourself so available. And I can speak from personal experience. You're very thoughtful and speedy with your responses. Well, for our viewers, I just want to turn it over to you. If you have any ideas for future show topics, please let us know on Twitter. We're always watching our Twitter stream at Radiology ACR. Let us know if you have any show ideas going forward by using the hashtag at ACR Bulletin Podcast. I also invite you to check out all of our past episodes at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and be sure to check out and subscribe to ACR's YouTube channel to see all our new episodes. Thanks again, Dr. Heller, so much. We really appreciate your time today. And please come back as this situation evolves. I think we're going to need you. You might be a regular guest at some point. But thank you so much to our listeners. This has been the ACR Bulletin Podcast. See you next time.